And I appreciate you taking the time again to talk to me. We're doing some interviews, leading up to the anniversary this week of 9/11, and wanted to talk to you a little bit about that day. If you would share what you can with me. I don't know how much of this stuff is still classified for you. I guess you know that. So
Yeah.
if I ask you something that's classified, you just tell me. Okay.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, there's nothing classified I'll talk about anyway.
Okay. All right. So folks understand you were in charge of the First Air Force, which was mostly Air National Guard. Is that correct?
Yeah, the continental United States NORAD region, which is one of three regions of NORAD, North American Air Defense Command, and it is First Air Force. So you wear several hats. The current commander is Commander of First Air Force, the continental United States NORAD region, and AF North, which is a component of Northern Command.
Tell me what your responsibilities were as Commander of First Air Force.
Well, our responsibilities were for the air defense and for air sovereignty mission of the United States of the lower 48. And that was our job. And by 9/11, our ability to respond had been reduced to about 7 sites around the country. But we tracked any unknowns coming into the United States, intercepted them. We followed the president regularly as part of our job. And we exercised in case there was an attack upon the United States, which most people thought was extremely remote at that particular time, less so now, even though there's many ways to do that. Yeah.
I've read an interview that you did with somebody, I guess, for the National Archives about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. It seems like 3 or 4 months after, maybe not even 3 months, maybe like 2 months after the attack, and picked up some interesting information about that for background information for folks. At this point in time, the Cold War was more or less over, and that had always been our threat. Our radar was pointed towards Russia and way up in the atmosphere and not low level, correct?
That's correct.
Tell me how that played into what happened on 9/11.
Well, kind of interesting. One of the things that was changing at that time, technology-wise, was the advent of non-state players and their ability to attack places that you would think that a non-state player could not do. And then less powerful states like Iran and others had ballistic missiles as well. And we thought about the capability to launch missiles from off of ships, boats, airplanes, drones, you name it. And one of the things that we had been working on in particular was an ability for us to provide surveillance, not only along the coast, but out at sea, and be able to connect into the Navy ship apparatus, which we didn't have that capability before. So, and one of the things we'd also worked on was the ability to connect different types of analog radars with digital radars, which played an important part in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Because unbeknownst to me, the FAA high altitude structure at the time was all digital, and the lower altitude structure for their radars was all analog. And if you were not using transponder, you know what transponders are, of course.
Yes, sir.
That an airplane sends out a beacon where it is. If transponders were off, these two types of radars could not communicate with one another. Interesting.
Tell me about that morning. Now, obviously, you were aware that the president was in Sarasota. He was in the state of Florida that day. Tell me how things unfolded. I understand you guys had you were in the midst of like a 4-day exercise at the time things started going kind of wrong.
Yeah, we were right in the middle of a NORAD exercise. It involved Canada, the United States, lower 48, and Alaska as well. But as that was happening, the Russians had decided to fly up past the Aleutian Islands up into the Arctic and Alaska was pulling out of that exercise. So we were in a video conference with NORAD and with Alaska, Canada at that particular time, just discussing that and getting ready for the exercise and what kind of scenario we would have and how we were going to interact. And just as that conference ended, my executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Kelly Duckett, handed me a note. And he said there was a note from Colonel Bob Marr from the Northeast Air Defense Sector up in Rome, New York, which controlled the northeastern part of the United States surveillance. Said, we have possible hijack and going on, call me. So I immediately went downstairs to our Air Operations Center and called him. He had airplanes on called runway alert. They had started the airplanes. They were sitting out at the end of the runway, waiting to get clearance to take off on a hijack. And I told him, go ahead and launch the airplanes. We'd get clearance later, because the way that is supposed to work is that if there is a hijack in place, then the airlines report the FAA goes to the Department of Defense, Department of Defense comes down to NORAD and to see if there are any airplanes available to be launched. But we didn't wait. We launched the airplanes, and as it just turns out, the moment they got airborne was when the first airplane, I believe it was American 11, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And that was kind of interesting. Later, talking to the pilots that were on the airplane, one of the pilots had been, this was some time ago, you know, he had been on the last airplane that had been hijacked in the United States. He had been intercepted that airplane many years before 9/11, just happenstance.
Unbelievable. So you get the call that, or you get the message that the first one had been hijacked and it had hit the World Trade Center, or actually, the one you got the call about it hijacked was one out of Boston. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, you remember the two airplanes that hit the World Trade Centers were both out of Boston.
Yeah.
One was American 11, the other one was United 175, I believe. Mm-hmm. And yeah, well, the way that transpired was FAA controller really didn't know who to call at all. And he knew that there were airplanes on alert in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And he called the tower, the control tower. They connected him to the alert shack where our pilots and maintenance people were sitting. And they said, you got to call the Northeast Air Defense Sector up there in Rome, New York. And that's kind of how that's transpired. But I did not know that this airplane had hit the tower. I was in our command post and literally watching the news channel, CNN at the time, and I saw this airplane crash in. And like everybody else, we didn't know what had happened. In fact, I didn't know it was an airliner. I thought maybe a light airplane had crashed in there. It was hard to tell the perspective at that particular time. So it wasn't until the second airplane hit, and then we suddenly know, hey, this is not a coincidence. And of course, that's when we were trying to get any airplane up in the Northeast airborne. We'd already launched airplanes out of Otis. The next closest airplanes that we had were at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And we got a call. I was a little confused myself at this particular time, but we got a call that on American 11 was headed south. Well, in fact, American 11 had crashed into the building, but sometimes the tracks with the FAA continue to move where the airplane should be as opposed to where it actually is. So at that particular time, once we saw that that airplane was moving south, we launched the airplanes out of Langley Air Force Base, which later, during this whole thing as it goes along, we would have sent up to intercept United 93. They actually did get on station just a little bit before United 93 crashed. But in the meantime, you may remember American 77 crashed into the Pentagon. And it crashed into the Pentagon about 3 or 4 minutes before our airplanes were on station, because I'm so, it bothers me a lot to this day, but we had set up during peacetime methodologies for scramble to ensure that we would not have a midair with airline or anyone. And those things were still in place. So when we scrambled the airplanes out of Langley Air Force Base in Hampton, Virginia, those airplanes headed out over the Atlantic. They had to talk to the Navy, who controlled the airspace out there, then got handed over to the Northeast Air Defense Sector. But by then they're 75 to 100 miles out over the ocean, had to turn around and come back to DC. So that was, it cost us some time. Could we have stopped them? I don't think so. But it was interesting. So American 77 had hit the Pentagon. I felt like, I'm an old guy, so I was in Vietnam, and I was at Da Nang. We used to call it Rocket City. And I remember when rocket attacks were coming in, I said, when is this going to end? And our outgoing fire is going to begin. And it's kind of the way you feel, so combat mentality. But we finally had the airplanes over DC, and you got to know that we had many airplanes being called acting strange or being hijacked. In fact, the number, we kind of lost count. It was either 21 or 22 airplanes that were the unknowns. Anyway, our airplanes were over Washington, D.C. 3 airplanes have already crashed into the buildings, 2 in the World Trade Center, 1 in the Pentagon. And I'm telling Colonel Marr, we need to push this airplane out towards this blip coming south, which turned out to be United 93. We didn't know it was United 93. And he suggested me, he said, maybe we ought to hold off. There could be something coming from a different direction, and we don't even know. We don't even know what it is. We said, okay, when it gets to be 100 miles, we will push out and intercept that airplane. Shanksville, Pennsylvania is 105 miles from Reagan Airport, which was the center of our attention, as it turns out. So the people on that airplane, the brave men and women on that airplane, rushed the cockpit, we believe. Everybody thinks that's true, and forced the airplane down to keep it from crashing wherever it was intended to go.
A lot of it has been made out of the authority to shoot down an airliner, and as the head of First Air Force, that you basically had that authority, but there was some confusion that day as to whether you could or should engage and take down an airplane. Is that correct, or am I misreading that?
I'm on the phone with the vice commander of NORAD, who happens to be a Canadian, Rick Fenley. He was 3-star general officer, General Fenley. In fact, the building shares his name out in Colorado Springs to this day. But Rick and I were talking, and I said, Rick, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to intercept this airplane if he comes within 100 miles. We're going to try to divert him using standard signals that pilots give to airliners. The airliners are supposed to know these signals, and they do. If they don't respond, we'll fire warning shots. And I said, Rick, under emergency authorization in our tech order that we follow, if we don't have anything from the president by then, we'll order that airplane to be shot down to save lives on the ground. And Rick said, we're trying to get authority from the president. And of course, that's a long story in and of itself. As you know, the vice president was in the basement of the White House. Secret Service was talking to the District of Columbia National Guard. For some reason, unbeknownst to them, NORAD is trying to run an operation. We were diverting AWACS to follow the president, launching F-16s out of Texas to intercept the president wherever he was going. They wouldn't tell us where he's going during this time frame. So we never actually received authority to shoot that airplane down until very, very late. And I think the 911 Commission uh, believes that we've got that authority about the last time that just before United 93 went down. But I really don't recall whether we had it or not. But that was our intent. Under emergency authority, we decided that's what we had to do.
You brought up
I'm glad we didn't have to do that, by the way. It would have been something that I would not care to have lived with, nor the pilots would have carried that out. And I believe they would.
I don't think anybody would have. Like you said, I think we owe a huge debt to those passengers on that plane who decided to take matters into their own hands. So, you mentioned Dick Cheney in the basement of the White House with the Secret Service or the CIA. There were things going on that you didn't know about. Obviously, it would have been nice probably for you to know about, to know how to carry out what you needed to do. But there was other moves going on. I read where you said I think the Vice President of the Secret Service of the CIA had ordered the jets out of Langley to go do some intercept.
Actually, the District of Columbia Air National Guard had F-16s. They were coming back from a mission and they landed. They had no ammunition on board. And the Secret Service, by orders of Vice President Cheney, said, get airborne and protect the White House. Little did he know, we already had airplanes overhead DC. F-16s out of Langley were over DC. We were not in contact with the Secret Service. We were on a red switch. We had one red switch. Now we have, at First Air Force, they have many, many, many different red switches, so people can talk in a very highly classified manner to the interagency, really, there. But those people believed that they were going to have to get airborne and do something. And there's a lady that talks about that she was prepared to ram United 93. But by the time she'd gotten airborne, United 93 was on the ground a half hour before. So there was lots of confusion. And in the meantime, we had these airplanes circling overhead. We later had F-15s as well as F-16s. We'd moved an AWACS. Not only was an AWACS an airborne warning and control aircraft. You know what an AWACS is, of course. We had one following the president that we diverted from a training mission. We'd moved one over DC. We had tankers that we diverted over DC. And so we'd set up these orbits. And you may remember by about that time, the FAA had ceased all operations, told everybody to land. And the military, General Eberhart, had declared Skatana, which means the military has taken over control of the airspace, basically. So we're watching all kinds of crazy things go on. But as this went on, and we're getting up to 21 or 22 of these airplanes are acting funny, my executive officer is listening to the red switch as we're dealing with these things. He said, you need to listen to this. The president is talking to the Secretary of Defense. So I listened, and what they were talking about was there was one more airplane that we were concerned about. Well, all of us were concerned about it. And it was a US air flight coming from Spain to the United States. And apparently there was some communications gaps and no one was exactly sure what that airplane was going to do. And the president said, well, let me know what happens because I want to come back to the White House. And I got a phone call right during this exact same time from Bob Marr, Colonel Marr, Northeast Air Defense Sector. He said, we just heard from the airline and the airplane has turned around. And in fact, it has already landed back in Madrid. And so only time I talked to on the red switch there, I picked up the phone. I said, Mr. President, we have confirmation that that last airplane is down. And he said, I'm coming back to Washington. I'm going to Washington.
As you look back on these events, been 20 years now, hard to believe it's been that long, but as you look back on this, is there, what are the lessons learned? Have we been able to make improvements in the way we respond to things like this? Because again, this was not a scenario that we had planned for as a nation?
No, we were not prepared for this scenario. I'd like to think we were, and we had many exercises that may have even included intercepting hijacked airplanes, but usually not hijacked airplanes with full of passengers. It would be a hijacked airplane that was stolen from someplace and had bombs on board, and they were going to crash the airplane someplace. But the things that really changed were more in terms of security on the ground. People still don't like going through the long security lines, but we didn't have those security lines, as you know. And the hijackers were able to get aboard these airplanes with knives and box cutters and use them lethally on that airplane. Couldn't do that today. I think that our surveillance just with video, if someone was looking for us today in an airport and we walked through that airport, they would find us with the video equipment that is out there these days. The stand up of Northcom, what we've done with that is to integrate some of the interagencies to allow them to work more effectively as well. And the military. The military, 1st Air Force, was a very small command, as you may remember in those days. We received quite a bit of money from our Congressman Alan Boyd at the time. It's called an earmark. It was a good earmark, and built a state-of-the-art air operations center, which is tremendously capable with many very classified capabilities that integrates them totally into the security apparatus of the United States government. So the military is much better prepared. The military recognizes its responsibilities within the United States. We have communications capabilities that are far better than we had that day. We had absolutely no way to look inside the United States other than to look outside the United States in those days. And that's changed. That's changed as well, Tom. So yes, we are better, but we cannot let our guard down, I don't believe. Al-Qaeda still exists. ISIS still exists. And there are plenty of people out there that would love to replicate what happened on that day when 2,996 people, I believe it was, or close to that, died. Most that ever died in one attack in the United States.
What will you do this Saturday? Anything to mark this anniversary?
No, not it is always a day when I receive a lot of messages and phone calls from people who worked with us that day. But I don't know that I'll do anything special. I'm kind of over going out and giving speeches, Tom, these days, but it'll always be in all of our memory, just as our parents and grandparents always remember December 7th, when Pearl Harbor was attacked.
First thing I thought of when I watched that happen that day was, this is Pearl Harbor all over again. Yeah.
And of course it was.
Yeah. General, I appreciate your time. Is there anything else you want to add?
I don't think so, Tom, other than the fact that in the aftermath of 9/11, I was just so proud of the work that our people did all over the United States. Not once, these missions flying orbits. We had orbits over 15 locations over the United States, quite a while, and over Washington, D.C. for over a year. Not once did we ever get a complaint about this. We deployed people to the centers, the New York Center, Boston Center, all around the country, so that if a military order had to be passed, they could pass that order. And we did that for a long time. No complaints. Everyone knew that this was their job and they had to do it. And I'm very proud of our military men and women, as well as the civilian, because I cannot tell you how much the FAA helped everybody during that time frame and afterwards.